Edith Pretty stands at the center of the modern story of Sutton Hoo. Born in 1883, she inherited a considerable fortune after her father died in 1925. She later purchased the Sutton Hoo estate in Suffolk and became curious about the unusual burial mounds located on her property. In 1937, she asked the self-taught archaeologist Basil Brown to investigate them, setting in motion one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made in Britain. Brown's excavations eventually revealed the remains of a remarkable 7th century ship burial. As the importance of the discovery became increasingly clear, professional archaeologists were brought to the site, and by 1939, the excavation included specialists such as Stuart and Peggy Piggott. Their work soon uncovered evidence that Sutton Hoo was far more significant than anyone had initially expected. The timing of the discovery, however, created serious difficulties. With war approaching and finally breaking out in September 1939, archaeologists had only a limited period in which to work. The excavation therefore took on the character of a rescue operation, with the team concentrating on recovering and protecting vulnerable objects before the site had to be closed. Despite these pressures, they uncovered an extraordinary collection of gold, silver, weapons, jewelry, and other valuable objects from the burial. Rather than keeping the treasures, Edith Pretty donated the entire collection to the British Museum. At the time, it represented the largest single donation the museum had ever received from a private individual. Her decision ensured that the Sutton Hoo objects would remain accessible for research and public display. Pretty did not live long after the discovery, dying in 1942. Archaeological work at Sutton Hoo resumed decades later. In 1965, Rupert Bruce Mitford directed a new campaign designed to investigate questions that the hurried 1939 excavation had been unable to resolve. Archaeologists carefully examined the burial mound and the surrounding landscape. Among their discoveries were chemical traces of phosphate in the soil, providing important evidence that a human body had originally been placed within the burial, even though the remains themselves had disappeared. A third major period of excavation began during the 1980s under Martin Carver. This project approached Sutton Hoo from a broader perspective. Instead of concentrating mainly on spectacular grave goods, Carver and his team studied the cemetery and surrounding landscape to understand the society that had created it. Their research explored social hierarchy, economic activity, burial customs, and the communities that occupied the region during the early medieval period. In 1991, Carver's team uncovered another extraordinary grave. Tudor-period treasure hunters had previously attempted to rob it, but their shaft had passed almost perfectly between two adjacent burial chambers. By sheer chance, both chambers survived largely undisturbed, preserving evidence that might otherwise have disappeared centuries earlier. One chamber contained the remains of a man buried with equipment associated with a warrior. The neighboring chamber held something much more unusual, the skeleton of a horse. The animal had probably been deliberately killed as part of the funeral ceremony and buried alongside its owner. The discovery provided striking evidence for the elaborate rituals and elite warrior culture associated with the Sutton Hoo Cemetery. The famous ship burial discovered by Basil Brown remains the centerpiece of Sutton Hoo. The vessel was approximately 89 feet long and 14 feet wide. Archaeologists could even identify areas where repairs had once been made to its structure, suggesting that this was not a ship constructed solely for burial. It had apparently been a genuine seagoing vessel before being brought ashore and transformed into a monumental grave. Certain components, including its mast and decking, appear to have been removed before burial. The extraordinary scale of the funeral naturally raises the question of who could have received such an elaborate burial. One of the strongest candidates is Redwald, King of East Anglia. Objects recovered from the grave indicate that the burial probably took place around AD 625, while historical sources place Redwald's death around AD 624. The chronological match, combined with the exceptional wealth of the burial makes him a convincing candidate, although the identity of the deceased cannot be proven with certainty. The objects deposited inside the main burial chamber demonstrate both enormous wealth and connections extending far beyond East Anglia. The most famous discovery is undoubtedly the Sutton Hoo helmet. When archaeologists found it in 1939, it had collapsed into hundreds of fragments. It was reconstructed after the original excavation and then reconstructed again in 1970 to 1971, when researchers were able to incorporate additional fragments discovered during later archaeological work. The helmet was richly decorated and designed to create an intimidating appearance. Dragon imagery played an especially important role in its decoration. 2 dragon heads appeared at the ends of the iron crest running across the top of the helmet, while another was positioned above the face between the eyebrows. Garnets were used to create the creature's red eyes, giving the helmet a dramatic and threatening appearance. Interestingly, the helmet may already have been several decades old when it was placed in the grave. It probably originated in the middle or later 6th century, raising the possibility that it was a treasured heirloom passed down through an elite family. Despite its elaborate decoration, it was not simply ceremonial. Its construction offered substantial protection to the wearer's head, meaning that it could have functioned effectively in combat even though there is no certainty that it was ever actually worn in battle. The burial also contained several other objects connected with warfare and aristocratic identity. A large decorated shield was positioned on a metal support, while an impressive sword was placed among the grave goods. Together with the helmet, these weapons presented the deceased as a powerful warrior and member of the highest level of early Anglo-Saxon society. Alongside the weapons were magnificent examples of gold craftsmanship. One of the finest is the famous Sutton Hoo gold belt buckle, decorated with extremely complex patterns of intertwined animals. The buckle also contains a concealed hollow space at the back. Scholars have suggested that this compartment may once have held a small sacred object, perhaps even a Christian relic. If so, it would offer another fascinating glimpse into a period when traditional Germanic customs and the expanding influence of Christianity existed side by side in early medieval England. The burial at Sutton Hoo also contained 2 magnificent shoulder clasps, probably used to fasten or support an elaborate cloak. Alongside them were the metal fittings of a purse, all produced in finely worked gold and decorated with carefully set garnets. Worn together with the other jewelry and weapons from the grave, these objects would have created an impressive visual display of wealth, authority, and elite status. Much of this sophisticated metalwork was probably produced in East Anglia itself. If so, the objects revealed that the kingdom possessed highly skilled craftsmen capable of creating luxury goods of exceptional quality. Supporting such specialized artisans required considerable wealth and resources, suggesting that 7th century East Anglia was politically and economically more developed than it was once assumed to be. Important discoveries were not limited to the central ship burial. Elsewhere at Sutton Hoo, archaeologists uncovered 3 elaborate hanging bowls made from copper alloy. Even more remarkable was the quantity of silver deposited at the site. Sutton Hoo produced the largest collection of silver objects known from an early medieval grave, and the silverware appears to have originated in the eastern Mediterranean. Their presence in England demonstrates the remarkable geographical reach of elite exchange networks during this period. Among these imported objects were 2 famous silver spoons, traditionally known as the Saulos and Paulos spoons. Earlier interpretations connected their inscriptions with the biblical apostle Paul and suggested that they might indicate the deceased had converted to Christianity. According to this interpretation, the names represented Saul and Paul and symbolized the adoption of the Christian faith. More recent research has made this interpretation less certain. The inscription read as Saulos may simply have resulted from an error by the craftsman and may originally have been intended to read Paulos. The spoons therefore cannot be treated as definite proof that the person buried at Sutton Hoo was Christian. Even without a religious interpretation, however, the spoons remain important evidence of the deceased's extraordinary status. Such objects had travelled a considerable distance before reaching East Anglia. They may have been purchased through long-distance exchange or presented as diplomatic gifts, possibly through connections with the Franks across the English Channel. Either possibility demonstrates that the individual buried at Sutton Hoo belonged to an international network of powerful elites. Fragments of luxurious textiles were also preserved within the burial. Although most survived only in small pieces, archaeologists have identified material that probably came from cloaks, blankets, decorative coverings, or wall hangings. These textiles would originally have added considerable color and richness to the burial chamber. Fine cloth was itself an important expression of status in the early medieval world. Producing high-quality textiles demanded enormous amounts of labor, from preparing fibers and spinning thread to weaving and finishing the fabric. Some textiles could also be colored with rare and expensive dyes. As a result, elaborate clothing and fabrics could communicate wealth just as effectively as precious metals or jewelry. Another fascinating object from the ship burial was a lyre, a stringed musical instrument played by plucking its strings. Its inclusion may reflect the importance of music in aristocratic culture, especially during feasts and gatherings where songs, poetry, and stories could reinforce the reputation of rulers and warriors. It may also have been placed in the grave so that music could symbolically accompany the deceased beyond death. The later excavations dramatically changed archaeologists' understanding of Sutton Hoo. During Martin Carver's campaign, researchers began investigating the areas between the great burial mounds, rather than concentrating exclusively on the monumental graves. They discovered that numerous additional burials were hidden throughout the surrounding landscape. This showed that Sutton Hoo was not simply a collection of magnificent graves belonging to a handful of powerful individuals. It formed part of a much larger cemetery complex that had been used in different ways over a considerable period. In several graves, the bodies themselves had completely decomposed, but darker stains preserved their outlines in the sandy soil. Archaeologists came to describe these eerie traces as ghost bodies. Unlike the carefully arranged elite burials, many of these individuals had apparently suffered violent deaths. Their bodies were found in unnatural or twisted positions, some with evidence that their ankles had been tied. Others appeared to have suffered broken necks, while several had been decapitated. Archaeologists identified a total of 39 individuals buried under these disturbing circumstances. These discoveries have led scholars to interpret part of Sutton Hoo as an execution ground. Nearby post holes may even represent structures associated with gallows. If this interpretation is correct, the landscape that contained the magnificent graves of rulers and warriors was later associated with punishment and public displays of authority as well. Further discoveries were made in 2000 during construction of the modern visitor center. Archaeologists uncovered dozens of additional cremation and inhumation burials, including 5 graves placed beneath relatively small burial mounds. The grave goods varied considerably, indicating differences in wealth and social position. Most were personal possessions, including objects such as combs and belt buckles. These graves were dated mainly to the 6th century, making them older than the famous 7th century ship burial. Archaeologists have suggested that some of the people buried there may have belonged to earlier generations of the families that eventually produced the kings of East Anglia. In this sense, the cemetery may preserve evidence for the gradual emergence of a regional ruling elite. The 6th century was a period when certain families were beginning to accumulate greater amounts of wealth, influence, and prestige than their neighbors. Over generations, these differences became increasingly visible in burial practices and grave goods. Sutton Hoo therefore provides archaeological evidence for the process through which powerful families developed into royal dynasties and early Anglo-Saxon political communities evolved into organized kingdoms. One of the most important aspects of modern research at Sutton Hoo is that archaeologists have deliberately chosen not to excavate the entire site. Excavation permanently alters an archaeological deposit, and future researchers may possess technologies and analytical methods that are unavailable today. Leaving parts of Sutton Hoo untouched therefore preserves valuable evidence for future generations. Instead, researchers can investigate the remaining landscape using non-invasive technologies such as ground-penetrating radar and laser scanning from drones. These techniques allow archaeologists to identify buried structures and study the shape and construction of the surviving mounds without immediately digging into them. Sutton Hoo is therefore not only one of Britain's greatest archaeological discoveries, but also a site where modern archaeology increasingly balances the search for new knowledge with the preservation of evidence for the future. Christianity began to establish itself firmly in Ireland during the early 5th century. The missionary Palladius played an early role in this process, but the figure most closely associated with Ireland's conversion was St. Patrick. While Christianity was expanding across Ireland, however, the situation in Britain was moving in the opposite direction. Roman political authority collapsed, Germanic peoples settled in increasing numbers, and Christianity weakened in many of the territories that became Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. By the 7th century, the direction of missionary activity had effectively reversed. Irish Christians now began helping to spread the religion back into Britain. One of the most influential centers in this movement was the monastery of Iona, founded by the Irish monk St. Columba during the 560s on an island off the western coast of Scotland. Iona became the heart of a wider network of Columban monasteries connecting Ireland with northern Britain. Northumbria became particularly important in this Irish missionary movement. During the reign of Edwin, Oswald of Bernicia had been forced into exile and spent part of this period among the monks of Iona. There he embraced their form of Christianity. After Edwin was killed, Oswald returned to Northumbria in 634, gained the throne, and renewed efforts to establish Christianity throughout his kingdom. The Christianity Oswald encountered at Iona differed in several customs from the tradition introduced into southern England by Augustine's Roman mission. By the early 7th century, two recognizable traditions had emerged in Britain and Ireland. They are often described for convenience as the Roman and Irish traditions, although both belonged to the wider Christian Church, and their disagreements concerned religious customs rather than fundamentally different religions. One visible difference involved the tonsure, the distinctive haircut worn by monks. Roman monks generally shaved a circular area on the crown of the head while leaving hair around it. Irish monastic communities followed a different practice, traditionally described as shaving the front or upper portion of the head. Although this might appear minor, such customs served as visible signs of religious identity. Far more important was the disagreement over the calculation of Easter. Because Easter commemorated the resurrection of Christ, determining the correct date for its celebration was a major religious concern. Unlike festivals fixed to a particular calendar date, Easter moved from year to year according to a system of calculation. During the 5th century, Rome adopted a method of calculating Easter that had been developed through Alexandrian scholarship. Older systems, however, remained deeply established in distant Christian communities, particularly in Ireland and among the Brittonic churches of Western Britain. Many clergy were reluctant to abandon traditions that their communities had followed for generations. Ireland itself was divided on the issue. Churches in the south were generally more receptive to continental influences and increasingly accepted the Roman calculation. Many northern Irish communities, including those connected with Iona, continued to preserve the older method. These differences would eventually become politically important when Irish missionaries began working in Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Rather than requesting missionaries from Canterbury, Oswald turned to Iona for assistance in converting Northumbria. The first missionary sent in response was a monk named Corman. His extremely severe approach to religious discipline proved poorly suited to the Northumbrian court and population, and his mission achieved little success. He eventually returned to Iona. Corman was replaced by Saint Aidan, whose approach proved considerably more effective. Aidan remained committed to a demanding monastic lifestyle, but showed greater patience and flexibility towards the people he hoped to convert. Under his influence, Christianity gained strong support at the Northumbrian royal court, although the kingdom initially adopted many customs associated with the Irish tradition, including its calculation of Easter. One of the most important results of Aidan's mission was the establishment of Lindisfarne. Located on a tidal island off the northeastern coast of England, the monastery was deliberately reminiscent of Iona and soon became one of the leading religious centres of Northumbria. From Lindisfarne, missionaries could travel throughout the kingdom and establish new Christian communities. Aidan favoured persuasion rather than coercion. He travelled through the countryside preaching and teaching Christianity directly to local communities. King Oswald sometimes assisted him personally. Because Oswald had spent years in exile among Irish-speaking Christians, he knew both Irish and Old English and could reportedly act as an interpreter, while Aidan addressed his Anglo-Saxon subjects. Aidan died in 651, but by then the political environment of northern England had changed considerably. Northumbria faced an increasingly dangerous rival in Mercia. Under King Penda, Mercia remained the most powerful pagan kingdom in England, giving the long political rivalry between the two kingdoms an additional religious dimension. Penda was one of the most formidable rulers of 7th century England. After gaining power in the early 7th century, he expanded Mercian influence westward into the Severn Valley and intervened repeatedly in the affairs of neighbouring kingdoms. East Anglia, Wessex, and especially Northumbria all experienced the consequences of his military ambitions. His impact on Northumbria was particularly dramatic. Penda had already participated in the defeat and death of King Edwin, an event that helped create the political circumstances in which Oswald became king. Oswald would eventually become another Northumbrian ruler to die while fighting the Mercian king. Concerned by Penda's growing strength, Oswald appears to have sought a decisive confrontation. In 642, he led an army into territory associated with Mercian power. On August 5th, the two sides met at the Battle of Maserfield, probably somewhere near the borderlands between Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms. Oswald was defeated and killed. According to Bede, Penda ordered Oswald's body to be dismembered after the battle, with his head and limbs displayed on stakes. Whatever the precise meaning of this treatment, later Christian tradition transformed Oswald's violent death into a story of martyrdom. The king who had promoted Christianity in Northumbria was increasingly remembered as a saint who had died fighting a pagan enemy. Stories of miracles soon became associated with Oswald's remains. One tradition claimed that an arm previously blessed by Saint Aidan remained miraculously preserved after the king's death. The limb eventually became an important relic, and possession of such remains could generate considerable competition between religious communities. Relics were much more than objects of private devotion in medieval Christianity. A famous saint's remains could attract pilgrims, donations, and royal patronage, increasing both the religious reputation and economic prosperity of a monastery. Traditions surrounding Oswald's arm consequently produced disputes between communities such as Bamberg and Peterborough over who possessed the prestigious relic. Oswald's defeat also transformed the political balance of England. Penda emerged as the dominant military ruler, while Northumbria temporarily lost much of its previous strength. More importantly, Oswald's death reopened the old division between Northumbria's two major components, Bernicia in the north and Deira in the south. Oswald's brother Oswiu inherited control of Bernicia, the traditional power base of their dynasty. Deira, meanwhile, again came under rulers associated with its own royal line. The political unity achieved under previous Northumbrian kings therefore weakened, and more than a decade would pass before Bernicia and Deira were firmly reunited. Penda continued to campaign aggressively against Christian rulers elsewhere. In 654, he defeated and killed King Anna of East Anglia, another prominent Christian monarch. His victories made Mercia the most powerful political force in much of Anglo-Saxon England. The following year, Penda launched a major campaign against Oswiu of Bernicia. His coalition included several allies, among them Ethelwald of Deira, Oswald's own son. Despite Penda's responsibility for Oswald's death, political ambition evidently outweighed family loyalty, and Ethelwald appears to have seen the campaign as an opportunity to strengthen his position in Northumbria. The campaign ended disastrously for Penda. In 655, Oswiu defeated him at the Battle of the Winwade, and the Mercian king was killed. His death removed the most powerful pagan ruler remaining in England and marked an important turning point in the religious history of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Penda was succeeded for a time by his son Peada, who had already accepted Christianity as part of the arrangements surrounding his marriage to one of Oswiu's daughters. Christianity subsequently became established in Mercia itself. Sussex, one of the last major pagan kingdoms, converted not long afterward, with royal marriage again playing an important role. Warfare, diplomacy, missionary activity, and dynastic marriages together brought Christianity to virtually all the major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The disappearance of the major pagan kingdoms did not end religious disagreements. Christianity was now dominant, but different communities still followed different customs. Northumbria was particularly affected because its royal family contained supporters of both the Irish and Roman traditions. King Oswiu had been shaped by the Irish tradition associated with Iona, while his wife followed Roman customs. This created practical difficulties within the royal household. Because the two traditions sometimes calculated Easter differently, one part of the court could still be observing the fasting season of Lent, while another was already celebrating Easter. Such differences were more than an inconvenience. Easter stood at the center of the Christian religious calendar, and disagreement over its date raised broader questions about religious authority. Oswiu increasingly wanted a single system that could unify the Northumbrian church and royal court. Politics made the issue even more urgent. Oswiu's adult son Alfrith had been given authority in Deira after the victory at the Winwade. Over time, however, Alfrith appears to have sought greater independence from his father. Religious disagreement offered him a useful political tool because he could support the Roman tradition while Oswiu remained connected to the Irish church. A major influence on Alfrith was Saint Wilfrid, one of the most energetic and controversial churchmen of 7th century England. Wilfrid strongly favored Roman religious customs and maintained close connections with continental Christianity. Around 660, he established a monastery at Ripon that followed Roman practices. His influence encouraged Alfrith to challenge the Irish-oriented traditions that remained powerful at Oswiu's court. Oswiu eventually decided that Northumbria needed a definitive settlement. In 664, representatives of the competing traditions gathered at what became known as the Synod of Whitby. The meeting became one of the most famous episodes in the history of early English Christianity, largely because of the account later written by the Venerable Bede. Bede portrays the gathering as a dramatic confrontation between two leading churchmen. St. Colman defended the customs associated with Iona and the Irish tradition, while St. Wilfrid argued for the Roman position. Behind questions such as the date of Easter stood a larger issue: which religious tradition possessed the stronger claim to authority? When Oswiu asked the two sides to explain the origins of their practices, Colman appealed to the tradition inherited from St. Columba and the community of Iona. For Colman and his supporters, these customs had been preserved by respected holy men whose missionary work had brought Christianity to Northumbria. Wilfrid responded by emphasizing the authority of Rome. He traced Roman practice ultimately to St. Peter, whom Christian tradition regarded as the leading apostle and the foundation of papal authority. Wilfrid referred to Christ's promise of the keys of heaven to Peter, presenting him as possessing a unique authority over admission to eternal life. According to Bede, this argument persuaded Oswiu. The king reportedly concluded that it was safer to follow Peter, since he did not wish to risk being rejected by the saint, believed to guard the entrance to heaven. Oswiu therefore supported the Roman position, and Northumbria officially adopted the Roman calculation of Easter and associated religious customs. The decision weakened the influence of the Columban tradition within the Northumbrian royal church. Colman refused to abandon the practices of Iona and eventually withdrew with some of his followers. Wilfrid, meanwhile, emerged with considerably greater prestige, and his close relationship with Ælfrith helped advance his ecclesiastical career. The traditional account of Whitby, however, should not necessarily be accepted as a word-for-word record of what happened. Bede wrote decades after the event and shaped the episode around questions of church unity and Roman authority that mattered deeply to him. The actual meeting was probably more politically complicated than his narrative suggests. Oswiu's decision may therefore have been motivated by more than theological arguments about Easter or St. Peter. Supporting Roman practice also allowed the king to remove an important source of internal division and strengthen his authority at a moment when his son Ælfrith was seeking greater autonomy. The Synod of Whitby was consequently both a religious and political turning point. It aligned Northumbria more closely with Roman and continental Christianity, while helping Oswiu consolidate control over his kingdom. Ælfrith gained little from the victory of the Roman tradition at the Synod of Whitby. Although he had strongly supported Wilfrid and Roman administrative structures weakened, he vanished from contemporary long-distance economic systems contracted, his ultimate and local communities increasingly solved problems without meaningful assistance from the imperial government. His father, King Oswiu, and possibly died during the resulting conflict. Wilfrid's position was equally complicated. After being selected as bishop, he travelled to Gaul to receive consecration from continental bishops. His prolonged absence created difficulties in Northumbria, and Oswiu eventually replaced him with Ceadda, better known as Saint Chad. Unable to exercise his episcopal authority, Wilfrid withdrew to his monastery at Ripon, where he remained for several years. The situation changed with the arrival of Theodore of Tarsus as Archbishop of Canterbury. During the following decade, Theodore and Wilfrid became two of the most influential figures in the English Church. Both were talented and energetic churchmen, but their conflicting personalities and different ideas about ecclesiastical government produced a long and complicated rivalry. Theodore's major objective was to reorganize the English Church into a more orderly institution. One of the first problems he addressed concerned the bishopric of Northumbria, centered on York. Initially, Theodore supported Wilfrid. He concluded that Oswiu had removed him improperly, dismissed Ceadda from the position, and restored Wilfrid as bishop. The organization of the English Church had developed alongside the political geography of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Because those kingdoms varied greatly in size and frequently changed their borders, their dioceses were equally irregular. Northumbria had grown into an enormous territory, making it increasingly difficult for a single bishop to supervise effectively. Theodore therefore proposed dividing the vast Northumbrian diocese into several smaller bishoprics. From his perspective, this would create a more efficient church administration and allow bishops to provide better pastoral care throughout the kingdom. Wilfrid, however, strongly opposed any plan that reduced the territory under his authority. Relations between the two churchmen gradually deteriorated. Theodore became frustrated by Wilfrid's resistance, while Wilfrid's forceful personality and uncompromising commitment to Roman customs also created enemies elsewhere. Even members of the Northumbrian royal family eventually became uncomfortable with his influence. The crisis reached its height during the reign of King Ecgfrith. Wilfrid continued resisting Theodore's plans to reorganize the Northumbrian church, while his relationship with the royal court worsened. When Ecgfrith demanded that Wilfrid be removed, Theodore chose not to defend the bishop. Wilfrid consequently went into exile on the European continent. This was not the end of the dispute. He later recovered his bishopric, lost it again, and experienced several further periods of exile and restoration. His career became a remarkable cycle of political conflict, ecclesiastical controversy, and missionary activity. By the time Wilfrid died around 709 or 710, at approximately 77 years of age, he had become one of the most controversial churchmen of early medieval England. His personality repeatedly brought him into conflict with kings and bishops, yet his extraordinary energy, commitment to Roman Christianity, and contribution to the development of the English Church gave him lasting historical importance. Much of what is known about 7th century Northumbria comes from Bede, himself a Northumbrian writer. One useful indication of changing political power appears in his description of 7 rulers who exercised unusually wide authority over the peoples south of the Humber. Raedwald of East Anglia appears 4th in this sequence. Before him came Ella of Sussex, Towlin of Wessex, and Ethelbert of Kent. These kings belonged to different southern kingdoms, showing that political dominance in early Anglo-Saxon England initially moved between several regional powers rather than remaining concentrated in one dynasty. After Raedwald, however, the pattern changed dramatically. The next 3 rulers were all Northumbrian kings: Edwin, Oswald, and Oswiu. Their appearance in succession demonstrates how strongly Northumbria dominated English politics during the middle decades of the 7th century. The later Anglo-Saxon Chronicle associated these exceptionally powerful rulers with the term Bretwalda, usually interpreted as something resembling ruler of Britain or wide ruler. The precise meaning of the word remains disputed, and it is uncertain whether contemporary 7th century rulers actually used it as a formal title. Bede himself never uses Bretwalda, since he wrote his history in Latin. It is therefore safer to understand these rulers not as kings of a unified England, but as monarchs whose military and political strength temporarily allowed them to dominate neighboring kingdoms. Their authority depended largely on personal power, alliances, tribute, and military success, rather than on a permanent institution of national kingship. Northumbria reached the height of its influence around the middle of the 7th century. The death of Penda of Mercia at the Battle of the Winwade in 655 removed its most dangerous rival. Oswiu emerged from the victory in an exceptionally strong position and was even able, for a time, to impose a degree of Northumbrian supremacy over Mercia itself. Northumbrian expansion was not directed only toward other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Its rulers also pushed northward and westward into territories still controlled by Brittonic-speaking peoples. These surviving British kingdoms had remained important political forces long after the end of Roman rule, but Northumbrian expansion gradually reduced their territory. Bernicia, the northern component of Northumbria, bordered the Brittonic kingdom of Gododin. Gododin occupied much of what is now southeastern Scotland, particularly the region south of the Firth of Forth. Its location made conflict with the expanding Bernician kingdom almost unavoidable. Fighting between Bernicia and Gododin occurred repeatedly around the beginning of the 7th century. The Britons were not simply passive victims of Anglo-Saxon expansion and sometimes launched campaigns of their own. Over time, however, Northumbria gained the advantage. A decisive advance came during Oswald's reign. In 638, Northumbrian forces penetrated deep into Gododin territory and captured Iden, the stronghold that developed into modern Edinburgh. This victory effectively secured Northumbrian control over much of the former Gododin territory, south of the Firth of Forth. Beyond the Forth lay several Pictish kingdoms. Writing roughly a century later, Bede claimed that Oswald exercised some form of supremacy even over these northern rulers. The exact extent of this authority is difficult to determine, but Northumbrian influence clearly reached far beyond the kingdom's traditional heartlands. Oswiu appears to have preserved much of the northern dominance established by his brother. By the later 7th century, Northumbria had therefore become a major power, extending its political influence from northern England into parts of what is now southern Scotland. Oswiu died in 670 and was succeeded by his son Ecgfrith. Ecgfrith was the child of Oswiu and his second wife Eanfled, herself the daughter of the earlier Northumbrian king Edwin and his Kentish wife. His ancestry therefore connected important branches of both Northumbrian and southern Anglo-Saxon royalty. Ecgfrith did not achieve the same political success as his father, but his reign witnessed important economic developments. Among the most significant was the appearance of silver coinage in Northumbria. These coins belonged to the wider early medieval tradition commonly associated with the small silver pieces known as sciatus. Although Anglo-Saxon rulers had produced coins before this period, the expansion of silver currency was an important development. These coins did not operate exactly like modern money, with an abstract value guaranteed by the state. Much of their worth came directly from the quantity and quality of silver they contained. The production of large numbers of small silver coins is particularly revealing. If such currency had existed primarily to preserve wealth, far fewer pieces would have been necessary. Their widespread minting suggests that coins were increasingly being used for everyday exchange and commercial transactions. This development points toward a growing and increasingly active economy. After centuries of economic contraction following the end of Roman government, parts of Anglo-Saxon England were once again becoming closely connected to regional and international trading networks. The growing circulation of silver provided the liquidity needed for this revival. Northumbria's economy nevertheless remained strongly agricultural. Livestock formed an essential part of rural production, particularly cattle, sheep, and pigs. Each animal contributed differently to the economy. Pigs supplied meat, while cattle provided food, labor, and valuable hides. Hides became an important Northumbrian export, but sheep were increasingly significant because of the expanding wool industry. Wool could be produced in large quantities, transported relatively easily, and transformed into textiles that were valuable both locally and abroad. By the 8th century, English wool was already being exported to continental Europe. This trade would continue expanding over the following centuries and eventually become one of the most important foundations of the medieval English economy. Northern England was particularly well suited to sheep farming, helping establish a commercial tradition that survived far beyond the Anglo-Saxon period. Northumbrian strength therefore depended on more than military conquest. By the 7th century, wealth was again flowing through Anglo-Saxon Britain as agriculture expanded, trade intensified, and silver currency became more common. These developments marked a significant recovery from the economic disruption that had followed the disappearance of Roman government. The most important urban centre of Northumbria was York. The Romans had known the city as Eboracum, while the Anglo-Saxons called it Eoforwic. Under Roman rule, it had been one of the major military and administrative centres of Britain, and unlike many former Roman towns, it did not simply disappear after imperial authority collapsed. Archaeological evidence suggests that York continued functioning as an important settlement throughout the early medieval period. Its Roman infrastructure and strategic location helped it survive the political transformation of Britain and eventually become one of the principal centres of the Northumbrian kingdom. York's importance was strengthened by its access to waterways and maritime trade. Merchants could connect the city with other parts of Britain, the North Sea coast, and continental Europe. Through these networks, Northumbria maintained commercial relationships with the Frankish world and with markets extending even farther beyond it. The survival and revival of York reflects the wider transformation of 7th century Northumbria. What had once been a fragmented post-Roman landscape was developing into a wealthy and ambitious kingdom supported by royal authority, Christianity, agriculture, craftsmanship, coinage, and international trade. Northumbria's political supremacy would not last forever, but during the 7th century it stood at the center of some of the most important changes taking place in early medieval Britain. The Anglo-Saxons did not simply abandon York's Roman past. Instead, they reused much of the city's existing infrastructure. The old Roman walls remained standing, and the basic street layout continued to shape the settlement. This continuity helped York preserve its importance at a time when many former Roman towns elsewhere in Britain had declined dramatically. York's growing status became even more obvious in 735, when Pope Gregory III granted the pallium to Ecgbert of York, formally recognizing him as an archbishop. This placed York among the most important ecclesiastical centres in England. By the 8th century, Northumbria was therefore anything but an isolated northern frontier. It was deeply connected to religious, intellectual, and commercial networks extending across Western Europe. Ecgfrith faced serious challenges almost immediately after becoming king, although his early reign was initially successful. In 671, a Pictish uprising threatened Northumbrian authority in the north, but Ecgfrith managed to defeat the rebels. For roughly the next 14 years, Northumbrian influence remained strong beyond the Firth of Forth and extended deep into territories inhabited by the Picts. His later policies were less successful. In June 684, Ecgfrith ordered a raid against Brega in eastern Ireland. Northumbrian forces attacked settlements, carried off captives, and plundered monasteries. The campaign seems to have had little strategic purpose, and reportedly went ahead despite warnings from the churchman Egbert of Ripon. Bede strongly condemned the Irish expedition and treated it as an example of Ecgfrith acting recklessly against religious advice. The attack damaged the king's standing with churchmen while producing few obvious political advantages. Even worse, this pattern of ignoring warnings would soon repeat itself with far more serious consequences. In 685, Pictish pressure on Northumbria increased sharply. Pictish forces attacked and besieged positions along the northern frontier, forcing Ecgfrith to decide whether to launch a major campaign. St. Cuthbert of Lindisfarne reportedly advised the king against marching north, but Ecgfrith ignored him and led his army into Pictish territory in May. The resulting confrontation became known as the Battle of Dún Nectáin in Irish sources and Nechtansmere in Anglo-Saxon tradition. The Picts were led by King Bridai mac Billy, who was probably related to Ecgfrith through the Northumbrian royal family. The battle was therefore not simply a clash between completely separate peoples, but part of the complicated dynastic politics of northern Britain. Bridi appears to have drawn the Northumbrian army into unfavourable terrain and then attacked it. Historians have proposed several possible locations for the battlefield, particularly Dunashton in Badenoch and Dunashan in Angus. Wherever the precise site was, the result was disastrous for Northumbria. Ecgfrith was killed during the battle, and much of his army was destroyed with him. The defeat immediately shattered Northumbrian supremacy north of the Firth of Forth. The bishopric at Abercorn, an important symbol of Northumbrian ecclesiastical expansion into Pictish territory, was abandoned shortly afterward. The consequences were lasting. Northumbria never again succeeded in imposing the same level of control over the Picts. The Battle of Dún Nectáin therefore marked the end of the kingdom's great northern expansion and forced Northumbrian rulers to adopt a more defensive position. In the longer term, the failure of Northumbrian expansion helped preserve an independent political zone north of the developing English kingdoms. Over the following centuries, the Picts and the Gaelic-speaking Scots gradually became part of the political process that produced the Kingdom of Scotland. The events of 685 can therefore be seen as one of several important moments in the long formation of the future boundary between England and Scotland. After Ecgfrith's death, the throne passed to his half-brother Aldfrith, another son of King Oswiu. Aldfrith's mother was an Irish princess, and unlike Ecgfrith, he had not originally been prepared for kingship. He had received a religious and scholarly education, and seems to have been expected to pursue a life connected with the church. The sudden destruction of Ecgfrith's army changed those plans. Medieval royal families sometimes recalled princes from monasteries or clerical careers when political circumstances demanded it, and Aldfrith became king because Northumbria urgently needed an adult member of the royal dynasty. His reign represented a noticeable change in direction. Rather than attempting to restore Northumbria's former military dominance over neighbouring peoples, Aldfrith placed greater emphasis on internal stability, education, religion, and culture. His rule is often associated with the foundations of the so-called Northumbrian Renaissance. This cultural flourishing eventually made Northumbria one of the leading intellectual centres of early medieval Europe. Monasteries became places of scholarship, manuscript production, theological study, and artistic innovation. The kingdom's reputation increasingly rested on learning and religious culture, rather than simply on military conquest. Northumbrian territorial expansion did not completely end, however. The Brittonic Kingdom of Reged, located across parts of modern northwestern England and southwestern Scotland, was absorbed into Northumbrian territory sometime before 730. Its acquisition gave Northumbria control across much of northern Britain, from the Irish Sea to the North Sea. Aldfrith died in December 704, and his death immediately produced a succession crisis. A relatively obscure nobleman named Eadwulf seized the throne. He may have possessed some connection to the Northumbrian royal family, although surviving sources do not clearly explain the basis of his claim. St. Wilfrid once again became deeply involved in Northumbrian politics. Since the Synod of Whitby, his relationship with successive kings had been turbulent, and he had repeatedly experienced exile because of conflicts with royal and ecclesiastical authorities. In 705, Wilfrid openly opposed Eadwulf and instead supported Osred, the young son of Aldfrith. Because Osred was still a child, his claim required powerful supporters, and Wilfrid played a central role in presenting him as the legitimate heir to the throne. Eadwulf's reign proved extremely brief. He was removed from power after only a short period, and Osred became king. Because the new monarch was too young to rule independently, Wilfrid became one of the dominant figures at court and effectively exercised considerable influence over the government during Osred's minority. Wilfrid did not survive for many more years. He died around 709, probably in his late 70s, an unusually advanced age for the period. By the end of his life, he had spent decades at the center of disputes involving kings, bishops, monasteries, and competing visions of how the English church should be organized. Osred's own reign eventually ended violently. After reaching adulthood, he was killed in battle under circumstances that remain uncertain. Some traditions connect his death with renewed conflict against the Picts, demonstrating that the northern frontier remained one of Northumbria's most persistent strategic problems. The kingdom that emerged after Ecgfrith was therefore very different from the expansionist Northumbria of Oswald and Oswiu. Its rulers could no longer dominate the Picts, but Northumbria remained one of the most important kingdoms in Britain. Increasingly, its greatest influence came through monasteries, scholarship, art, trade, and religious institutions, rather than through territorial conquest alone. During the Northumbrian Renaissance, artistic and intellectual life developed through a remarkable combination of outside influence and local tradition. Some works deliberately imitated styles that had become fashionable on the European continent, while others blended continental Christianity with older Anglo-Saxon and Irish imagery. The result was not a simple copy of foreign culture, but a distinctive artistic language shaped by several traditions at once. One of the most important centers of this cultural activity was the monastery of Lindisfarne, located just off the eastern coast of Northumbria. Because it had been founded through the Irish missionary tradition, Lindisfarne preserved a strong connection with the religious and artistic culture of Iona. Irish influence remained especially visible in its manuscript production and decorative style. At the same time, a more Roman and continental form of monastic culture was spreading through Northumbria. St. Wilfrid had strongly supported this orientation, but another major figure was Benedict Biscop, founder of the twin monasteries of Monkwearmouth and Jarrow. Benedict Biscop traveled to Rome 5 times and became deeply familiar with continental monastic institutions. His experiences convinced him that Northumbria could benefit from the artistic, architectural, and intellectual traditions he had encountered abroad. In 674, King Ecgfrith granted him land to establish a monastery that later became known as Monkwearmouth. A few years afterward, Benedict received additional territory and founded a second monastery at Jarrow, roughly 20 miles away. The two houses eventually functioned closely together and became one of the most important centers of learning in early medieval England. Benedict did not rely entirely on local expertise when constructing his monasteries. He brought skilled craftsmen from the continent to introduce architectural methods that were still uncommon in Anglo-Saxon England. Among them were glassworkers who produced glazed windows, something that was exceptionally rare in Britain at the time. Books were equally important to Benedict's vision. During his repeated journeys abroad, he acquired manuscripts for the monastic library and transported them back to Northumbria. Over time, the collection grew to several hundred volumes, an extraordinary number for an early medieval monastery. Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow soon became famous not only for collecting books, but also for producing them. Their scribes created manuscripts of such high quality that some were sent back to continental Europe. This reversal is significant. Northumbria was no longer simply importing culture from abroad, but had become capable of producing works admired elsewhere. The most celebrated example is the Codex Amiatinus, an enormous and beautifully prepared manuscript of the Latin Bible. Produced in the Monk Wearmouth Jarrow community, it contains the earliest surviving complete copy of the Latin Vulgate Bible in a single volume. Its scale and craftsmanship demonstrate the extraordinary resources available to Northumbrian monasteries. Nearly 80 surviving manuscripts can be associated with Northumbria with reasonable confidence, considerably more than can be linked to any other contemporary Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Most originated in monasteries and were overwhelmingly religious in subject matter. Lindisfarne itself became one of the greatest centers of manuscript production. Works associated with its artistic tradition include the Echternach Gospels and the Durham Gospels, but the most famous achievement is undoubtedly the Lindisfarne Gospels. The manuscript represents one of the greatest achievements of what scholars traditionally call insular art. The term is used for a distinctive artistic tradition that developed across Britain and Ireland, where Christian Mediterranean influences were combined with Celtic and Germanic decorative forms. Unlike many manuscripts whose exact place of production is uncertain, the Lindisfarne Gospels can be connected securely with the monastery of Lindisfarne. Their creator is traditionally identified as Eadfrith, who served as Bishop of Lindisfarne between 698 and 721. The manuscript contains the 4 canonical Gospels of the New Testament. Every page was carefully planned, with lines of text arranged in a highly controlled and balanced manner. The script belongs to the distinctive insular writing tradition and differs noticeably from contemporary continental handwriting. Its decoration is even more extraordinary. Interlocking patterns, geometric designs, animal forms, and Christian symbolism are combined with tremendous precision. The manuscript therefore represents the broader character of Northumbrian culture, Christian in purpose, but deeply influenced by artistic traditions inherited from Ireland and the Germanic world. Northumbria's cultural achievements were not limited to manuscripts. One of the finest surviving examples of its monumental stone sculpture is the Ruthwell Cross, an elaborate standing cross dating to the 8th century. Today, the monument stands at Ruthwell in southern Scotland, but when it was created, the region belonged to the Kingdom of Northumbria. Its location is therefore a reminder of how far Northumbrian political and cultural influence once extended northward. The cross is particularly important because its inscriptions preserve some of the earliest known examples of Old English writing. Text appears alongside carved religious scenes and is written using both Latin letters and Germanic runes. Parts of the inscription closely resemble passages from the Old English poem known as The Dream of the Rood. In that poem, the cross itself becomes a speaking character and recounts its role in the crucifixion of Christ. The imagery is especially powerful because the cross is presented almost like a loyal warrior serving its Lord. This reflects a broader tendency in Anglo-Saxon Christianity to express Christian ideas through concepts familiar from Germanic heroic culture. Another extraordinary product of this cultural environment is the Frank's casket. It is one of the most complex and mysterious objects to survive from Anglo-Saxon England. Its modern name comes from Sir Augustus Wollaston Franks, the 19th century collector who donated it to the British Museum, rather than from any connection with the medieval Frankish kingdom. The object itself is a relatively small, portable chest. Most of its panels survive together, although one side became separated from the rest and is now preserved in an Italian museum. The British Museum displays a replica of that missing section alongside the surviving pieces. The casket was probably produced in Northumbria during the first half of the 8th century. It was carved from whalebone and covered with an astonishing combination of images and inscriptions. Even the writing reveals the cultural complexity of its makers. The inscriptions use more than one language and more than one writing system, including Old English, Latin, Roman lettering, and runes. This deliberate mixture suggests that the craftsman was comfortable moving between several intellectual traditions. The combination was almost certainly intentional rather than accidental. The object presents Christian, Germanic, classical, and heroic traditions as parts of the same cultural world. Northumbrian society had embraced Christianity, but older myths and identities had not simply disappeared. This is particularly obvious in the images carved across the different panels. As scholars such as Richard Abels have emphasized, the casket draws from an unusually wide range of stories. Biblical scenes appear beside Germanic legends and episodes inspired by classical or historical traditions. In this sense, the casket almost resembles a miniature encyclopedia of the cultural world available to an educated Northumbrian in the 8th century. Its maker seems to have placed very different traditions together deliberately, expecting viewers to recognize connections between them. The clearest Christian image appears prominently on the front panel. It depicts the adoration of the Magi, showing the wise men presenting gifts to the infant Christ. Such an image would have been especially appropriate if the box originally contained something precious, perhaps a religious relic or another valuable object. Immediately beside this scene, however, appears something entirely different: the Germanic legend of Wayland the Smith. Wayland was a legendary craftsman whose story centered on imprisonment, revenge, violence, and escape. According to the traditional tale, King Nidhad captured Wayland and prevented him from escaping by crippling him. Wayland eventually took a terrible revenge. He killed the king's sons and transformed parts of their bodies into objects, while also attacking the king's daughter before escaping captivity. To a modern viewer, placing the peaceful adoration of the Magi beside such a brutal legend may seem deeply contradictory. Yet the pairing may reveal how early Anglo-Saxon Christians understood their cultural inheritance. Christianity had introduced a new religious framework, but older heroic stories remained meaningful. Richard Abels has suggested that the two scenes should therefore be interpreted together rather than separately. The casket's maker may have been attempting to reconcile the inherited world of Germanic myth with the newer Christian order that had transformed Northumbrian society during the previous century. Wayland's violent revenge could also have carried a warning about loyalty and power. The Magi recognize and honor their new divine ruler, while Wayland's story demonstrates the consequences of oppression and betrayal. Viewed together, the panels may suggest that allegiance to a lord, whether earthly or divine, carried serious obligations. The Franks casket therefore captures one of the defining characteristics of the Northumbrian Renaissance. Christianity had transformed the intellectual world of Anglo-Saxon England, but it did not erase everything that had existed before. Instead, Christian scripture, Roman learning, Irish artistic traditions, Germanic mythology, and Anglo-Saxon heroic values were combined into something distinctly Northumbrian. The most influential figure to emerge from the Northumbrian Renaissance was not primarily an artist, but a scholar. Bede, later known as the Venerable Bede, was born around 672 or 673, at a time when Northumbria still stood among the strongest kingdoms in Britain. He was educated in the monastic environment associated with Benedict Biscop, and quickly distinguished himself through exceptional intellectual ability. One of Bede's most fascinating works was De Temporum Ratione, or The Reckoning of Time, written around 725. The book examined a wide range of subjects connected with the natural world, including astronomy, the movement of the heavens, and the behavior of the tides. At the center of the work was the problem of measuring time. Bede compared different chronological systems used by civilizations from ancient Egypt to his own age. This interest was not simply theoretical. Much of the discussion ultimately served one major practical purpose: determining the correct date on which Christians should celebrate Easter. Because Easter was a movable feast, calculating its date required considerable mathematical and astronomical knowledge. Medieval scholars had to understand lunar cycles, solar years, calendars, and other chronological systems. The Christian need to calculate Easter therefore encouraged the preservation and development of scientific learning in medieval Europe. The same problem also contributed unexpectedly to the growth of historical writing. Monasteries produced Easter tables that listed the dates of the feast many years into the future. Scribes gradually began adding brief notes beside particular years, recording important events such as royal deaths, battles, unusual natural phenomena, or other memorable occurrences. Over time, these short chronological notes developed into annals, yearly records arranged in sequence. Such annals eventually became valuable source material for larger historical works. Bede himself drew on traditions of this kind when composing his history of the English Church and peoples. Bede also helped popularize a chronological system that eventually became standard throughout much of the Western world. Events were dated in relation to the incarnation of Christ, producing the system associated with Anno Domini, meaning in the year of the Lord. Although Bede did not invent the system, his widespread use of it helped establish it as a normal method of historical dating. Mercia had already experienced a period of military prominence under the pagan king Penda during the middle of the 7th century. After his death, however, the kingdom temporarily lost some of its influence. His Christian sons Peada and Wulfhere ruled in a political environment still heavily shaped by the power of Northumbria. Mercian succession was also unstable. Wulfhere was followed by his brother Ethelred, who eventually withdrew into monastic life. Wulfhere's son later became king, but likewise abandoned secular rule for a monastery. Another ruler, Ceolred, followed. This rapid turnover prevented Mercia from immediately transforming Penda's earlier military successes into lasting supremacy. The situation changed dramatically with the accession of Ethelbald in 716. A descendant of Penda's wider royal family, Ethelbald remained king for more than 4 decades, ruling until his assassination in 757. His long reign gave Mercia the political stability needed to become the strongest kingdom in southern England. Kingship in 8th century England depended heavily on reputation and military strength. A ruler who appeared weak risked falling under the influence of a more powerful neighbor. Ethelbald successfully imposed varying degrees of superiority over several kingdoms, particularly Wessex and Essex. One effective way to gain influence over another kingdom was to intervene in a disputed succession. A ruler who helped a claimant secure a throne could expect political loyalty in return. This appears to have played an important role in Ethelbald's relationship with Wessex. Wessex had previously enjoyed stability under King Ino, who ruled until 726. When Ina abdicated without leaving an obvious close male heir, competition for the throne followed. 2 principal figures emerged, the ealdorman Oswald and Ethelherd. Ethelherd ultimately secured the kingship, and he may have benefited from Mercian support. If Ethelbald assisted his rise, the new West Saxon king would have entered power owing a significant political debt to Mercia. Mercian pressure on Wessex continued. In 733, Ethelbald appears to have taken territory from the West Saxons and incorporated it into his own sphere. Wessex repeatedly challenged Mercian influence afterward, forcing Ethelbald to reassert his position on several occasions. His success was not always complete, but by the closing years of his reign, Mercia clearly possessed the advantage. Wessex remained independent, yet it could no longer ignore Mercian power. An equally important development occurred in the southeast. Essex controlled London, which had become the most important commercial centre in Britain. During the 730s, surviving royal charters suggest that political control of London gradually shifted away from Essex and toward Mercia. This was enormously valuable to Ethelbald. London connected inland England with overseas markets and generated both economic and political influence. Mercian control over the city therefore strengthened the kingdom in ways that battlefield victories alone could not achieve. Ethelbald also involved himself in northern affairs. In 747, he apparently cooperated with the Picts, traditional enemies of Northumbria, and launched an attack that reached York. The ability to strike one of Northumbria's principal cities demonstrates how widely Mercian military influence had expanded. Ethelbald's relationship with the church was often tense. St. Boniface, an English missionary active on the European continent, wrote critically about the Mercian king and accused him of serious moral failings. In 747, a major ecclesiastical meeting known as the Council of Cloveshow addressed several problems within the English church. The council strongly emphasized conformity with Roman religious practice and reinforced the close relationship between English Christianity and the papacy. The council also attempted to establish clearer distinctions between clergy and lay people. Clerics were expected to dress in ways appropriate to their religious status and to maintain stricter separation from secular households and lifestyles. 2 years later, Ethelbald issued an important charter reducing many of the obligations previously imposed on church estates. Religious communities were largely exempted from ordinary royal burdens, although certain essential duties remained. This concession may have been partly intended to repair his strained relationship with church leaders after Boniface's criticism. Ethelbald's long reign ended suddenly and violently in 757. A later continuation of Bede's history reports that he was murdered at night by members of his own bodyguard. The motives remain unknown, and it is impossible to determine whether the killing resulted from personal hostility, court intrigue, or a larger political conspiracy. The assassination of a powerful king could easily trigger civil war, but Mercia's instability was relatively brief. A ruler named Bjornred seized the throne, yet his control lasted less than a year. He was soon overthrown by Offa, who became one of the most famous rulers in Anglo-Saxon history. Offa belonged to the Mercian royal dynasty, although his closest direct ancestors had not ruled for several generations. His grandfather, however, had been a first cousin of Ethelbald, giving him a recognizable dynastic connection. Once secure on the throne, Offa began strengthening royal control over Mercia itself. Smaller regional kingdoms such as Lindsey, the Hwicce, and the Magonset had long existed within the wider Mercian sphere. Under Offa, much of their remaining political independence appears to have disappeared. His ambitions extended far beyond the Midlands. Offa gradually imposed authority over several neighboring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and achieved a level of dominance that surpassed that of most earlier English rulers. East Anglia initially retained a significant degree of independence. Its king, Ethelbert II, was still issuing coins in his own name during the middle years of Offa's reign. Before long, however, East Anglia seems to have fallen under Mercian supremacy. By the early 790s, Offa was striking coins in East Anglia under his own authority. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the conflict ended brutally in 794 when Offa ordered the execution of King Ethelbert. Wessex represented a more
Soldiers
serious
disappeared,
challenge. Administrative structures weakened,
following
taxation and long-distance economic systems recovered territory they had previously
local
lost
communities
to Mercia.
increasingly solved
Offa
problems
spent years
without
attempting
meaningful
to reverse
assistance
these
from the
gains.
imperial
A
government.
decisive victory came in 779 when Offa defeated King Cynewulf of Wessex and recovered some disputed territory. After Cynewulf was murdered in 786, continuing instability within Wessex further strengthened Mercia's position. Offa's most famous physical legacy is the enormous earthwork traditionally known as Offa's Dyke. Stretching along much of the western frontier of Mercia, It consisted of a large bank and ditch, marking the boundary between Mercian-controlled territory and the Welsh kingdoms. The dike was not necessarily a continuous fortified wall in the modern sense, but it represented an extraordinary investment of labor and organization. Its construction demonstrated the resources available to Offa and the importance he attached to controlling the western frontier. The landscape shaped by this frontier continued to influence later political geography. Sections of Offa's dike still run close to the modern border between England and Wales, making it one of the most visible surviving monuments of Anglo-Saxon royal power. Offa's reputation extended far beyond Britain. He communicated directly with Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. Charlemagne would later be crowned emperor in 800, reviving an imperial title in Western Europe after more than 3 centuries. The fact that Charlemagne corresponded with Offa demonstrates the international significance that Mercia had achieved. Offa was no longer simply a regional English king, but a monarch capable of negotiating with one of Europe's dominant dynasties. Around 789, Charlemagne proposed a marriage between one of Offa's daughters and his son Charles. Such a union would have represented an exceptionally prestigious alliance for the Mercian royal house. Offa responded boldly. Rather than simply accepting the proposal, he suggested that his own son, Ecgfrith, should simultaneously marry one of Charlemagne's daughters. This counter-proposal effectively demanded equality between the 2 dynasties. The exchange illustrates the extraordinary confidence of Offa's kingship. By the late 8th century, Mercia had grown from one of several competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a major political power, capable of dominating much of England and dealing directly with the greatest ruler of continental Western Europe. Charlemagne was famously unwilling to send his daughters away from the Frankish court through diplomatic marriages. Several remained officially unmarried throughout their lives, even though some became involved in relationships at court. Offa's proposal was therefore difficult for Charlemagne to accept, for both personal and political reasons. There was also a question of status. A double marriage between the children of Offa and Charlemagne would have implied a remarkable degree of equality between the Mercian and Carolingian dynasties. Charlemagne was apparently willing to consider a Mercian princess as a wife for his son, but he was much less enthusiastic about allowing one of his own daughters to marry Offa's heir. The negotiations consequently collapsed. Charlemagne reacted strongly to Offa's counterproposal and temporarily restricted commercial relations with Britain. What had begun as a potential dynastic alliance instead produced a brief diplomatic crisis between the 2 rulers. The dispute did not last. Within a few years, relations between Mercia and the Frankish kingdom had improved, suggesting that both sides valued their political and commercial connections too much to allow the disagreement to become permanent. Charlemagne even guaranteed protections for English pilgrims traveling through his territories on their way to Rome. At the same time, however, the Frankish court appears to have provided refuge to some political exiles from Mercia. Charlemagne therefore maintained friendly relations with Offa, while preserving alternative political connections that could become useful if circumstances changed. Offa closely followed developments taking place across the Channel, particularly Charlemagne's reforms. One important example was coinage. After the Frankish ruler reorganized his monetary system, Offa introduced reforms of his own in England. The new Mercian pennies displayed the king's name, while also identifying the moneyer responsible for producing the coin. Their quality and consistency helped establish a model that later Anglo-Saxon rulers would imitate. Offa's currency reforms demonstrate how closely 8th century England was connected with economic developments on the continent. War played a fundamental role in the formation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Small political territories gradually disappeared as stronger rulers conquered weaker neighbors, absorbed their lands, or reduced their kings to subordinate status. Military success was therefore one of the main forces behind the emergence of larger kingdoms such as Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. An Anglo-Saxon army probably looked broadly similar to other armies operating in early medieval Western Europe. One of its most characteristic battlefield formations was the shield wall, in which warriors stood tightly together in a long defensive line. Each soldier carried his shield on the left side while keeping his weapon ready in the right hand. By overlapping or closely positioning their shields, warriors created a relatively solid barrier. The effectiveness of the formation depended heavily on discipline because a single opening could weaken the soldiers standing nearby. Before the two armies entered close combat, they could exchange missiles. Arrows, javelins, and other projectiles were thrown or fired in an attempt to injure opponents, disrupt their formation, and weaken morale before the main clash. The shield walls would then advance toward one another, or one side might remain in position and wait for the enemy attack. Once the formations collided, the fighting became extremely physical. Warriors pressed their shields against their opponents while searching for opportunities to strike through gaps with spears, swords, or other weapons. The main objective was not necessarily to kill every enemy soldier individually. Instead, warriors attempted to break the opposing formation. Once enough gaps appeared in a shield wall, cohesion could collapse rapidly. A disciplined formation might then turn into a disorganized mass of individuals vulnerable to pursuit. Most Anglo-Saxon warriors appear to have fought on foot. Horses certainly had military value, particularly for wealthy warriors who could use them to travel quickly to and from a campaign, but mounted troops do not seem to have formed a regular battlefield cavalry force during most of this period. There are possible exceptions. A famous Pictish carved stone at Aberlemno in Scotland shows mounted warriors in combat. Some scholars have connected the scene with the Battle of Nechtansmere in 685, where the Picts defeated the Northumbrian army of King Ecgfrith. If this interpretation is correct, Anglo-Saxon warriors may occasionally have fought from horseback. Nevertheless, the wider evidence suggests that mounted combat remained unusual. The typical Anglo-Saxon battle was still dominated by infantry fighting in close formations with shields, spears, and swords. The sword has become one of the most recognizable symbols of medieval warfare, and Anglo-Saxon swords were impressive weapons. They generally possessed long, straight blades sharpened on both sides. High-status examples could have richly decorated hilts and pommels, making them objects of prestige as well as practical weapons. Producing a good sword required considerable skill. Early medieval metalworkers could not always create a strong and reliable blade from a single uniform piece of iron using the technology available to them. Instead, smiths could combine several iron rods or strips, twist them together, and forge weld them into a single blade. This technique, known as pattern welding, produced distinctive patterns within the metal, while also allowing craftsmen to combine different qualities of iron. A sword was normally carried in a scabbard suspended from a belt. Anglo-Saxon swords were particularly suited to powerful cutting and slashing attacks, especially in the close combat that followed the collision of opposing shield walls. Because swords were expensive and difficult to manufacture, they also carried considerable social meaning. Possessing a finely made sword could demonstrate wealth and status, and decorated weapons were sometimes passed between generations or placed in elite graves. Despite the prestige associated with swords, the spear was probably the most common weapon on the Anglo-Saxon battlefield. It was cheaper and easier to manufacture, required fewer resources, and could be extremely effective in formation fighting. The spear also carried social significance. Weapon ownership was closely connected with the status of a free warrior, and the ability to carry a spear could symbolize membership in the free male population. Enslaved people, by contrast, could face severe punishment for possessing weapons without permission. Anglo-Saxon spears varied considerably in size, with some measuring roughly 5 feet, while others could approach 9 feet in length. Their shafts were frequently made from ash, a strong and flexible wood well suited to weapon construction. Different spear designs served different purposes. Some were light enough to be thrown as javelins before close combat began, while longer and heavier examples were designed primarily for thrusting from behind a shield. Their versatility made spears ideal weapons for the shield wall. A warrior could attack while remaining partly protected by his own shield and those of the men beside him, making the spear both practical and deadly. Axes formed another part of the Anglo-Saxon arsenal, although their role changed over time. Earlier Anglo-Saxon examples were generally smaller than the enormous axes often associated with later Viking warfare. These weapons could have curved or distinctive S-shaped cutting edges, and some were light enough to be thrown. Such throwing axes appear to have declined in importance by around the 7th century. Centuries later, contact and conflict with Scandinavian warriors introduced different forms of axe warfare into England. Anglo-Saxon troops eventually adopted the much larger two-handed battle axes associated with Viking and Danish military traditions. Anglo-Saxon warfare was therefore based less on spectacular individual weapons than on discipline and collective fighting. Swords carried prestige, spears equipped large numbers of warriors, and axes provided additional striking power, but the survival of an army ultimately depended on maintaining formation. On the battlefield, the strength of the shield wall could determine the survival of a king, an army, and sometimes an entire kingdom. The military strength of an Anglo-Saxon king began with his personal following. At its center were the thanes, wealthy landholders who owed loyalty and military service to the ruler. Many possessed followers of their own, while some remained regularly at the royal court and formed the king's most dependable group of warriors. When a campaign required more manpower, the king could summon a much wider force known as the fyrd. This consisted largely of free men who were expected to perform military service when called upon. Rather than functioning as a single permanent army, the fyrd was organized locally, allowing different districts to provide contingents when the kingdom faced war or invasion. Military obligations formed part of a wider relationship between ruler and subject. Men were expected to fight when necessary, while the king was responsible for defending the kingdom and maintaining justice. Anglo-Saxon law shared many features with other Germanic and Celtic legal traditions found across Northern Europe. A central principle was compensation rather than punishment by the state. When someone was injured or killed, the offender could be required to make a payment to the victim or the victim's family. The amount depended both on the seriousness of the offense and on the social rank of the person harmed. This system is commonly associated with the concept of vergild, literally the value placed upon a person. Its purpose was partly practical. Compensation offered families an alternative to private revenge. Without such mechanisms, one killing could provoke retaliation and produce a blood feud lasting generations. Determining guilt could nevertheless be difficult. When two people presented conflicting accounts, both might swear that their version was true. A person could strengthen an oath by producing supporters, commonly described as oath helpers. These supporters were not necessarily eyewitnesses. Their role was to affirm that they trusted the person making the oath and considered the claim believable. Family members, friends, dependents, and political allies could therefore become extremely important during legal disputes. Before Christianization, the primary image of Anglo-Saxon kingship centered on warfare and leadership rather than legislation. Kings commanded warriors and protected their people, but there was little tradition of rulers presenting themselves as systematic creators of written law. The arrival of Augustine's Roman mission helped change this understanding of royal authority. Christianity brought Anglo-Saxon rulers into closer contact with traditions in which powerful rulers acted as lawmakers, including Roman emperors and contemporary Frankish kings. Ethelbert of Kent became the first known Anglo-Saxon king to issue a written law code. The surviving text is especially remarkable because it is preserved only in a manuscript produced in the early 12th century, roughly 500 years after the laws themselves were originally composed. Despite this late survival, Ethelbert's laws provide valuable evidence for the transformation of Anglo-Saxon society. The church already enjoyed special protection. Crimes involving churches, priests, or ecclesiastical property could receive particular penalties, reflecting Christianity's rapidly growing place within the political system. The laws also reveal an expanding concept of royal authority. Compensation remained central, but the king increasingly claimed a financial interest in legal offenses. A crime was no longer treated entirely as a dispute between two individuals or families. It could also be understood as a violation of the king's peace. The ruler could therefore demand a payment of his own in addition to whatever compensation was owed to the victim. This provided kings with additional revenue, but it also expressed an important political principle. Maintaining public order was becoming part of royal authority. Some provisions reveal surprisingly specific problems. Ethelbert's code, for example, addressed the destruction or breaking of hedges in order to gain access to another person's property. The fact that hedge breaking received explicit attention suggests that it occurred frequently enough to require legal regulation. Economic transactions were also covered. Agreements that collapsed into disputes could threaten social stability, so royal law increasingly attempted to regulate property and exchange, as well as violence and theft. For much of the first century of written Anglo-Saxon legislation, Kent remained the principal centre of lawmaking. Ethelbert was followed by other Kentish kings who issued their own codes, including Wetred around 695. Around the same period, written royal law appeared prominently outside Kent. One of the most important examples was produced under Ine, King of Wessex, from 689 to 726. His laws provide unusually detailed evidence about West Saxon society and royal government. Because Wessex regularly faced military competition with neighbouring kingdoms, Ine devoted considerable attention to the fyrd. Men who failed to answer a military summons could be fined, demonstrating that participation in the kingdom's defense was regarded as a formal obligation rather than a voluntary act. The size of such penalties could vary according to social rank. Ine's laws repeatedly reinforced hierarchy, making clear that Anglo-Saxon society assigned different legal responsibilities and values to people depending on their position. Loyalty to a lord was another major concern. A commoner who abandoned his lord without authorization could be forced to return and pay a fine of 30 shillings, an extremely substantial penalty. Personal dependence upon powerful lords was therefore becoming increasingly embedded within the legal system. Ine's legislation also demonstrates that Anglo-Saxon law was capable of innovation. Law codes did not merely record customs inherited unchanged from the distant past. Kings could modify legal procedures when they believed existing practices were inadequate. This can be seen in cases involving accusations of murder. Ine required an accused person to include at least one individual of substantial social standing among his oath helpers. Simply gathering a group of low-status relatives or friends was no longer necessarily sufficient. The requirement encouraged accused individuals to obtain the support of someone with recognized authority or reputation. More broadly, Anglo-Saxon legal development gradually placed greater importance on relationships with lords and socially prominent individuals rather than relying exclusively on kinship networks. Ine's laws also reveal ethnic differences within Wessex. As West Saxon territory expanded toward southwestern Britain, it absorbed populations who continued to identify with Brittonic language and culture. These Britons did not necessarily receive the same legal valuation as Anglo-Saxons. Under parts of the West Saxon compensation system, a Briton could possess a lower Vergild than an Anglo-Saxon of comparable position. Law therefore reflected not only social hierarchy, but also the unequal status of different ethnic communities within the expanding kingdom. Written documents became increasingly important for economic and property transactions. Kings and other authorities used charters to create permanent records of agreements, particularly those involving land. Recording the details in writing reduced the possibility of later disputes and represented an early development toward more formal systems of property and contractual rights. For historians, however, these documents present a major difficulty. Many surviving medieval charters are forged, Scholars therefore have to examine handwriting, vocabulary, formulas, witnesses, historical circumstances, and other details to determine whether a document genuinely belongs to the period it claims. Forgery became particularly common among monasteries and other religious institutions from the 10th century onward. A monastery might produce a document claiming ancient ownership of an estate in order to defend its property against competing claims. Not every forged charter was necessarily created to steal land. Medieval documents were vulnerable to fire, water, warfare, decay, and simple loss. A religious community that had genuinely possessed land for generations might recreate a lost document because it needed written evidence to defend an otherwise legitimate claim. Medieval administrators also developed methods for making documents more difficult to falsify. One particularly ingenious solution was the chirograph. A chirograph was created by writing the same agreement 2 or sometimes 3 times on a single sheet of parchment. Each participant in the transaction would eventually receive 1 copy. Between the duplicated texts, the scribe wrote the word chirographum, meaning a handwritten document. The parchment was then cut through this word, frequently using an irregular or toothed line. The resulting pieces could later be placed together. If their cut edges and divided lettering matched exactly, this provided evidence that the documents had originally formed part of the same agreement. The distinctive jagged division became known as an indenture, a term that later contributed to expressions such as indentured servant. A formal royal grant of land or privileges was commonly expressed through a document known as a diploma. Such documents presented the transaction as something protected not merely by royal authority, but also by God. Diplomas frequently contained religious formulas invoking divine protection and threatening anyone who violated the agreement with spiritual punishment. These formal sections were normally written in Latin, the international language of the Western Church, and educated administration. When a charter needed to describe the actual boundaries of an estate, however, scribes often switched to Old English. Local landmarks, streams, hills, roads, forests, and place names were easier to identify accurately in the language used by the people who lived in the region. This mixture of Latin and Old English illustrates the practical character of Anglo-Saxon administration. Latin provided prestige and formal authority, while the vernacular offered greater precision when dealing with the realities of the local landscape. Land grants were among the most valuable political resources available to kings. Religious institutions could receive estates in recognition of their spiritual role, while nobles could be rewarded for military service and political loyalty. Kings could also use charters to grant exemptions rather than land. A favored monastery or aristocrat might be released from certain taxes or from obligations to supply goods, labor, or services to the crown. Written law and charters therefore became instruments of political power as well as mechanisms for maintaining justice. Kings could reward supporters, strengthen alliances, attract the cooperation of the church, and bind powerful nobles more closely to the monarchy. There were nevertheless certain responsibilities from which rulers were generally reluctant to grant exemptions. These became associated with the so-called 3 common obligations: military service in the field, the maintenance of roads and bridges, and participation in the construction or defense of fortifications. Many surviving charters explicitly preserve these duties, even when granting extensive privileges in other areas. They were considered essential to the survival of the kingdom because they provided the ruler with soldiers, functioning infrastructure, and defensive strongholds. Anglo-Saxon government therefore rested on a close relationship between military obligation, law, landholding, and royal authority. Kings protected society and distributed land, while freemen and nobles provided military and public service. As written law and documentation became more widespread, these relationships were increasingly recorded and regulated, laying important foundations for the later development of English government and law. Near the end of Offa's reign, A new threat appeared along the coasts of Anglo-Saxon England. Scandinavian raiders began attacking northeastern Britain, and the most famous early assault struck the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793. Similar attacks soon followed elsewhere, introducing a form of maritime raiding that would become familiar across much of Europe. The attack on Lindisfarne is traditionally regarded as one of the events marking the beginning of the Viking Age, a period lasting roughly 2.5 centuries. During these generations, Scandinavian raiders, merchants, settlers, and conquerors transformed political boundaries, commercial networks, and cultural connections across Europe and beyond. Lindisfarne was an especially shocking target. The monastery was one of the most prestigious religious institutions in Anglo-Saxon England and had played a major role in the Christianization of Northumbria. Its association with saints such as Aidan and Cuthbert gave it enormous spiritual importance. An attack upon such a sacred place therefore caused outrage far beyond the immediate destruction. The Vikings who attacked Western Europe came primarily from Scandinavia, especially the regions that later developed into Denmark and Norway. Modern national identities should not be projected too neatly onto the 8th and 9th centuries, however. These people belonged to numerous communities and political groups rather than unified Danish or Norwegian states. Scandinavian expansion also moved in several directions. While warriors and settlers from Norway and Denmark increasingly operated in the North Sea and Atlantic worlds, groups associated particularly with Sweden traveled eastward across the Baltic and entered the great river systems of Eastern Europe. These eastern networks connected Scandinavia with regions around the Black Sea, Byzantium, and eventually the Islamic world. Scandinavian groups became involved in the political and commercial networks from which the Rus's principalities emerged, with centers such as Kiev later becoming particularly important. In the Atlantic, Scandinavian sailors pushed progressively farther west. They established permanent settlements in Iceland and later colonized Greenland. Around the end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th century, Norse explorers even reached North America, although their settlements there proved temporary. Britain was much closer and therefore became a frequent destination. The attack on Lindisfarne was only an early warning of what was coming. During the first half of the 9th century, Scandinavian raids became increasingly frequent, larger, and more ambitious. Monasteries were among the most attractive targets for Viking raiders because they concentrated enormous amounts of portable wealth in relatively small areas. Churches possessed chalices, crosses, reliquaries, ornaments, and other religious objects manufactured from gold, silver, and precious stones. Even manuscripts could represent considerable wealth. Important books were expensive to produce, and their covers could be decorated with valuable metals and gemstones. For raiders interested primarily in material value, the religious significance of such objects mattered far less than the precious materials from which they were made. Looted objects did not necessarily survive intact. Metalwork could be broken into pieces, while gold and silver objects could be melted down and converted into bullion. A successful raid could therefore transform sacred treasures into portable wealth that was easy to transport, exchange, or redistribute. Monasteries also served as places where local communities stored valuables. Because a monastery might be one of the few substantial stone complexes in an area, people sometimes considered it safer than ordinary wooden buildings for storing coins and other possessions. Stone walls, however, offered only limited protection against determined attackers. Viking raiders could use fire to force defenders or monks from buildings before stripping the complex of valuables. Monasteries located close to rivers or coastlines were especially vulnerable because raiders could arrive, attack, and withdraw before local forces could respond. One reason early Viking attacks were so successful was their unexpected arrival from the sea. Although the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons themselves had crossed the North Sea during the migrations of earlier centuries, by the 8th century, the English kingdoms were overwhelmingly focused on warfare and politics on land. Religious communities had little reason to expect large-scale attacks from across the sea. Indeed, monasteries were sometimes deliberately established on islands or isolated coastal locations because separation from secular society was considered spiritually desirable. That isolation now became a dangerous weakness. Scandinavian maritime technology allowed raiders to exploit this vulnerability. Viking shipbuilders produced vessels that combined speed, durability, flexibility, and relatively shallow drafts. The most famous of these vessels became known as the longship. Longships could cross open seas, but were also capable of operating close to shore and moving along rivers. Their shallow construction allowed warriors to land in places without developed harbors and penetrate surprisingly far inland through waterways. This mobility transformed warfare. Viking forces could appear with little warning, attack an exposed settlement, collect valuables and captives, and return to their ships before a substantial defending army could assemble. Exactly how Scandinavian sailors navigated long distances remains debated. They certainly possessed extensive practical knowledge of winds, currents, tides, stars, coastlines, and recognizable landmarks. Generations of maritime experience would have made such environmental knowledge highly sophisticated. Some researchers have suggested that Scandinavian navigators may also have used devices capable of helping determine the sun's position under difficult conditions, possibly involving special crystals sometimes associated with the idea of a sunstone. The precise extent to which such techniques were actually used remains uncertain. Whatever methods they employed, Scandinavian sailors demonstrated an extraordinary ability to move through the North Atlantic and European river systems. Their ships gave them a strategic flexibility that many of their opponents initially struggled to match. The image of Vikings as nothing more than violent raiders gives an incomplete picture. Scandinavian expansion was also driven by commerce, settlement, exploration, and the search for economic opportunities. The same people who attacked one community could trade peacefully with another. Viking merchants became part of enormous commercial networks, connecting northern Europe with regions thousands of kilometers away. Scandinavian traders exchanged commodities such as furs, hides, amber, slaves, metalwork, and other valuable goods. One of the clearest indications of the scale of these networks is the discovery of large quantities of Islamic silver coins in Scandinavia and other regions connected with Viking trade. Such finds demonstrate that Scandinavian commercial activity ultimately reached markets linked to the Islamic world. The distinction between merchant and raider was not always clear. A Scandinavian expedition might trade when favorable terms were available, but turn to violence when an easier opportunity for profit appeared. Commerce and warfare could therefore form different parts of the same economic strategy. Extortion provided another profitable option. Instead of attacking a wealthy settlement, Viking leaders could demand payment in exchange for leaving it untouched. Communities facing destruction sometimes concluded that paying the attackers was cheaper than attempting resistance. A spectacular example occurred during Viking attacks on Paris in the 9th century. Scandinavian forces demanded an enormous payment in gold and silver in return for withdrawing, rather than continuing to devastate the city. The Franks ultimately agreed to pay. From the Viking perspective, such arrangements could be perfectly rational. If wealth could be obtained through negotiation without risking warriors in a difficult assault, there was little reason to fight unnecessarily. For the communities facing them, however, the distinction between trade, tribute, extortion, and plunder could be terrifyingly thin. Viking expeditions combined maritime mobility with commercial sophistication and military violence, allowing Scandinavian groups to exploit opportunities wherever they appeared. The Viking Age therefore cannot be understood simply as an era of destruction. Scandinavians created new settlements, expanded trade routes, connected distant economies, and reshaped political systems across Europe. Yet for an isolated monastery or coastal settlement watching unfamiliar ships approach the shore, those broader historical consequences offered little comfort. The arrival of Viking warriors could mean robbery, captivity, destruction, or death within a matter of hours. The Vikings could be extremely effective fighters when circumstances required open battle. Wealthy and high-ranking warriors were more likely to carry expensive swords alongside spears, while men of more modest status often relied on axes. For ordinary warriors, the spear remained the most accessible and widespread weapon because it was inexpensive, practical, and deadly in formation. Protection centered on the round wooden shield, an essential part of Scandinavian warfare. Viking shields could be decorated, sometimes with designs inspired by the mythology and symbolic traditions of the Norse world. Like their Anglo-Saxon opponents, Viking warriors commonly fought together in a shield wall, standing close enough to create a defensive barrier while using spears and other weapons to attack through openings. Scandinavian warriors are also traditionally associated with a wedge-shaped formation known as the Svinfylking, or boar snout. Instead of maintaining a long defensive line, warriors concentrated themselves into a narrow formation designed to strike a particular point in the enemy line with maximum force. Such a tactic carried obvious risks. A concentrated wedge could expose its sides to attack, and if the initial breakthrough failed, maintaining the formation during prolonged close combat would have been extremely difficult. Its success depended on quickly disrupting the opposing force. The Vikings nevertheless achieved an impressive number of victories, partly because they carefully exploited mobility and surprise. Many early attacks were directed against monasteries, settlements, or small groups that had little opportunity to prepare a coordinated defense. Viking warfare was therefore effective, not simply because Scandinavian warriors were individually formidable, but because they frequently chose favorable circumstances in which to fight. The first period of Viking attacks coincided with a major change in Anglo-Saxon politics. Northumbria had dominated much of 7th century England, followed by the rise of Mercia during the 8th century. By the 9th century, however, Wessex was increasingly emerging as the strongest Anglo-Saxon kingdom. West Saxon expansion had already brought large areas of southern Britain under its influence. By the early 9th century, Wessex had extended its authority across much of the territory east of the River Tamar and was becoming the principal political force in southern England. A major turning point came during the early 9th century when Wessex gained dominance over Kent, Essex, and Sussex. By around 830, these southeastern kingdoms had largely entered the West Saxon sphere, and members of the Wessex royal dynasty were placed in positions of authority there. West Saxon power continued to develop after Æthelwulf became king in 839. His reign, however, coincided with a dangerous increase in Scandinavian attacks. Wessex was becoming stronger at exactly the moment when Viking warfare was becoming more organized and ambitious. In 835, Scandinavian raiders attacked the Isle of Sheppey off the Kentish coast. The following year, a West Saxon army suffered defeat at Carhampton in Somerset, demonstrating that Viking forces could threaten both the eastern and western parts of the kingdom. Wessex nevertheless proved capable of fighting back. In 851, Æthelwulf and his son Æthelbald confronted a substantial Viking force at the Battle of Aclea in Surrey. The West Saxons won an important victory, demonstrating that Scandinavian armies were dangerous but far from invincible. During the middle decades of the 9th century, the nature of Viking activity changed dramatically. Earlier expeditions had often involved relatively small raiding groups that attacked, collected wealth, and returned to their ships. Increasingly, much larger fleets began arriving with ambitions that went beyond temporary plunder. The decisive escalation came in 865, when a large Scandinavian coalition traditionally known as the Great Heathen Army arrived in England. Instead of conducting a short coastal raid, these warriors remained for extended campaigns and systematically attacked the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Their success was made easier by England's political fragmentation. There was no single ruler capable of organizing a unified defense. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex Each possessed their own kings, armies, interests, and rivalries. Viking commanders could therefore confront their opponents separately. Later Scandinavian tradition associated the leaders of the invasion with the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok. Among the most famous was Ivar the Boneless. The historical details surrounding Ragnar and his family remain difficult to separate from later legend, but several Scandinavian commanders clearly played major roles in the campaigns. The army initially established itself in East Anglia in 865. Rather than immediately fighting, the East Anglian authorities reached an agreement with the newcomers and supplied them with horses. Access to large numbers of mounts dramatically increased Viking mobility on land. After spending the winter in East Anglia, the army moved north toward Northumbria. The kingdom was already weakened by internal political conflict, making it particularly vulnerable. In 866, Viking forces captured York, the principal city of Deira, and one of the most important urban centers in Britain. York gave the invaders an exceptionally valuable base. Its Roman defenses, commercial importance, and strategic position made it ideal for controlling northern England. Scandinavian influence in the city would eventually become one of the defining features of Viking settlement in Britain. The great heathen army subsequently turned toward Mercia. Rather than risk destruction, King Burgred negotiated with the invaders and paid them to withdraw toward York. Such arrangements could provide temporary relief, but did nothing to remove the wider Viking threat. Mercia's inability to defeat the invaders contributed to the kingdom's declining prestige. A realm that had dominated much of England under rulers such as Ethelbald and Offa was increasingly unable to protect its own territory without negotiation or outside assistance. Eventually, Viking pressure broke Mercian political power. Much of the kingdom came under Scandinavian control, while the remaining western portion survived under Anglo-Saxon rulers operating within a greatly reduced political framework. Scandinavian settlement became particularly strong in eastern Mercia. Important centres developed around Lincoln, Derby, Leicester, Stamford, and Nottingham. These towns later became collectively famous as the Five Boroughs. The Five Boroughs became major centres of Scandinavian political authority. Administrative structures weakened, commerce, taxation, and long-distance economic systems contracted, remained visible, and local communities increasingly solved problems without meaningful assistance from the imperial government and legal traditions. East Anglia was attacked in force in 869, despite having initially accommodated the Viking army several years earlier. King Edmund attempted to resist, but was defeated and captured. Later, Christian tradition transformed Edmund's death into one of the most famous martyr stories of Anglo-Saxon England. According to accounts written after the event, his captors tied him to a tree, shot him repeatedly with arrows, and finally decapitated him. The historical details are uncertain, and there is no clear evidence that Edmund was killed specifically because he refused to abandon Christianity. This created some difficulty because martyrdom traditionally required death for the Christian faith rather than simply death in battle or political conflict. Nevertheless, Edmund rapidly acquired the reputation of a saint. Stories circulated about miracles associated with his remains, and a religious community developed around his burial place in Suffolk. The settlement eventually became known as Bury St. Edmunds. During the later Middle Ages, its monastery developed into one of England's most important pilgrimage centres, demonstrating how the violent political events of the Viking invasions could later be transformed into powerful religious traditions. By the later 9th century, Scandinavian armies had fundamentally altered the political map of England. Northumbria and Mercia had been divided, while independent East Anglia had effectively disappeared. Large areas of northern and eastern England now stood under Scandinavian control. London became another obvious target. The city was already one of Britain's greatest commercial centres and had previously been disputed between Mercia and Wessex. Its wealth and strategic position on the Thames made it enormously valuable to anyone seeking to dominate southern England. Viking forces repeatedly attacked London from the 830s onward. The city's surviving Roman fortifications offered substantial protection, but they also made London useful to Scandinavian armies once they gained access to it. In 871, the Great Heathen Army spent the winter inside London, using the old Roman defences as shelter. The exact nature and duration of Viking control remains uncertain, but the occupation demonstrated that neither Mercia nor Wessex could guarantee the security of one of England's most important cities. By this point, the situation facing the Anglo-Saxons was extremely dangerous. Scandinavian forces controlled enormous territories and possessed influence over York and London, arguably the two most important urban centres in England. Only Wessex remained a major Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had not been divided or conquered. Yet even Wessex faced constant attacks from both land and sea, and there was no guarantee that it would survive. By 871, therefore, the Viking conquest of Anglo-Saxon England appeared close to completion. Northumbria had fallen, East Anglia had been destroyed as an independent kingdom, Mercia had been gravely weakened, and Wessex stood increasingly isolated. The survival of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms now depended heavily on Wessex. At precisely this moment of crisis, a new ruler emerged who would reorganize West Saxon resistance and fundamentally change the direction of the conflict. That ruler was Alfred the Great. Under Alfred, the struggle against the Vikings would develop from a desperate attempt to preserve Wessex into a much larger political project, one that would eventually contribute to the creation of a unified Kingdom of England. One of the most striking aspects of Alfred's life is how unlikely it originally seemed that he would ever become king. He was one of 5 sons of King Ethelwulf and had 4 older brothers ahead of him. The eldest died during their father's lifetime, while 3 others eventually ruled Wessex in succession. Their unusually early deaths gradually moved Alfred toward a throne that had once seemed far beyond his reach. During Alfred's childhood, Wessex was already experiencing the growing pressure of Viking attacks. The kingdom suffered defeats but also achieved important victories, and unlike several other Anglo-Saxon states, it remained politically intact. Wessex also maintained an important relationship with neighbouring Mercia. In 853, Ethelwulf assisted the Mercians during a campaign connected with unrest in Wales. The alliance was reinforced through marriage when Ethelwulf's daughter became the wife of Burgred, King of Mercia. These dynastic connections would later become particularly valuable as Scandinavian pressure increased. Succession within the West Saxon royal family was complicated. One persistent problem was finding an appropriate political role for adult sons who were expected eventually to become kings, but whose fathers were still alive. A practical solution was to give an heir responsibility for part of the kingdom. When Ethelwulf became king in 839, his eldest son Ethelstan was placed in charge of Kent and associated southeastern territories. This allowed a royal prince to gain experience while remaining within the wider authority of the West Saxon dynasty. Ethelstan died sometime after 851, altering the succession once again. His younger brothers moved closer to power, while Ethelbald emerged as the most important surviving heir. In 855, Ethelwulf made the remarkable decision to undertake a pilgrimage to Rome. Because such a journey required him to remain outside England for more than a year, he entrusted substantial authority in Wessex to Ethelbald. Ethelbert, another son, was given responsibility for Kent and the southeastern territories. The young Alfred accompanied his father to Rome. The journey exposed him at an early age to the wider Christian world beyond Britain and brought him into contact with one of the great religious and political centers of medieval Europe. While in Rome, Ethelwulf displayed his wealth and royal status through generous gifts. He met the Pope and other leading figures and contributed resources to support English pilgrims visiting the city. The journey demonstrated that Wessex was increasingly connected with the political and religious networks of continental Europe. On the return journey, Ethelwulf visited the court of Charles the Bald, ruler of West Francia and a member of the Carolingian dynasty. The meeting produced an important dynastic alliance when Ethelwulf married Charles's daughter Judith. Judith's position in Wessex was highly unusual, she was formally crowned and anointed as queen, practices that carried strong religious and political symbolism. West Saxon tradition had generally avoided granting the king's wife the full title and ceremonial status of queen, making Judith's elevation particularly significant. The marriage also created an immediate succession problem. Ethelbald had governed Wessex during his father's absence and expected eventually to inherit the kingdom. The arrival of a young, formally crowned queen created the possibility that Ethelwulf might father additional sons whose Carolingian ancestry could strengthen their claims to the throne. When Ethelwulf finally returned to England, Ethelbald refused simply to surrender his authority. Rather than risk civil war, father and son reached a compromise and divided power between them. Ethelbald retained control in the western part of the kingdom, while Ethelwulf governed the eastern territories. The arrangement was unstable but did not last long. Ethelwulf died in 858, leaving Ethelbald as king. Ethelbald himself died only 2 years later, in 860. The crown then passed to Ethelbert, another of Alfred's brothers. His reign was similarly brief, ending with his death in 865. Of Ethelwulf's 5 sons, only Ethelred and Alfred were now still alive. Ethelred became king, while Alfred, approximately 16 years old, emerged as his closest political and military supporter. The timing could hardly have been more dangerous. Scandinavian warfare was entering a new phase, and the survival of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was increasingly uncertain. The later 860s witnessed the campaigns of the Great Heathen Army, which operated on a scale far beyond the earlier Viking raids. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia all suffered devastating attacks as Scandinavian armies moved repeatedly across England. Alfred was drawn into warfare while still a young man. In 868, he accompanied West Saxon forces sent to assist Mercia against the Vikings. The campaign failed to produce a decisive victory, and the Mercian king eventually negotiated with the invaders. Around this period, Alfred strengthened his connections with Mercia through marriage. He married Ealhswith, daughter of the important Mercian nobleman Ethelred Musil. Their marriage produced 5 children who survived childhood and later played important roles in the politics of England. The Scandinavian army eventually turned directly against Wessex. By the end of 870, Viking forces had entered West Saxon territory, beginning one of the most intense periods of warfare the kingdom had yet experienced. The year 871 became famous for its extraordinary series of battles. West Saxon forces repeatedly confronted Scandinavian armies, sometimes winning and sometimes suffering serious defeats. Neither side was initially able to destroy the other. One of the greatest West Saxon successes came at the Battle of Ashdown, probably fought on January 8, 871, somewhere in modern Berkshire. Alfred and Ethelred faced a Viking army commanded by leaders including Bagsec and Halfdan. The West Saxons won the battle, and Bagsec was killed. Alfred's prominent role in the victory contributed greatly to his emerging reputation as a military commander, although the victory did not eliminate the Viking threat. Only a few months later, the political situation changed dramatically. Shortly after Easter in 871, Ethelred died, leaving Alfred as the only surviving adult son of Ethelwulf. There were other possible heirs. Ethelred had sons of his own, meaning Alfred's nephews possessed legitimate dynastic claims. Yet they were still children, and Wessex was fighting for survival against experienced Viking armies. Placing a minor on the throne under such circumstances would have been extremely dangerous. Alfred therefore became king. According to the arrangements made within the royal family, he and Ethelred had previously agreed that Alfred would inherit first, while Ethelred's sons would eventually receive recognition of their own claims rather than being permanently displaced by Alfred's children. This solution worked during the immediate emergency, but it left a dynastic problem that would later return. For the moment, however, Wessex had an adult warrior king capable of leading armies in person. Alfred's first months as ruler were hardly triumphant. Soon after taking the throne, he suffered a serious military defeat and was forced to negotiate with the Vikings. The precise terms of the agreement have not survived, but the Scandinavian army withdrew from Wessex and moved toward London. It is quite possible that Alfred secured their departure through payment, following a strategy already used by other Anglo-Saxon rulers. The agreement gave Wessex several valuable years of relative peace. For roughly 5 years, Viking armies concentrated their attention elsewhere, allowing Alfred to preserve his kingdom and prepare for future conflict. The respite eventually ended. In January 878, the Viking leader Guthrum launched a sudden winter attack against Alfred's royal residence at Chippenham. The timing was particularly effective because the assault came during the Christmas season, when the West Saxon court was not prepared for a major military campaign. The surprise was devastating. Many of Alfred's followers were killed or scattered, and the king narrowly escaped capture. With organized resistance collapsing around him, Alfred fled with a small group of loyal companions. He eventually found refuge in the marshlands around Athelney in Somerset. Protected by difficult terrain, Alfred and his remaining followers could hide from Viking forces while maintaining contact with supporters elsewhere in Wessex. The situation was extraordinarily dangerous. Northumbria and East Anglia had already fallen under Scandinavian domination, Mercia had been broken apart, and now the leadership of Wessex had been scattered. For a brief period, the last major independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom appeared close to destruction. It is during Alfred's time in hiding that one of the most famous legends in English history is traditionally placed. The story of Alfred and the burnt cakes was not recorded until long after his lifetime, so it cannot be treated as reliable evidence for what actually happened. Nevertheless, the legend became popular because it expressed qualities later generations associated with Alfred: patience, humility, endurance, and the ability to recover from disaster. According to the story, Alfred took shelter in the home of an ordinary peasant family while concealing his royal identity. The woman of the household was unaware that the fugitive staying with her was the King of Wessex. While preparing cakes, she asked Alfred to watch them while she attended to other work. Alfred agreed, but soon became distracted by his thoughts. Instead of paying attention to the food, he supposedly began considering the desperate condition of his kingdom and thinking about how he might rebuild resistance against the Vikings. The cakes remained unattended and eventually began to burn. When the woman returned, she discovered what had happened and angrily scolded Alfred for failing to perform such a simple task. Still unaware of his identity, she treated him exactly as she would have treated any careless guest. Rather than revealing himself or reacting with royal anger, Alfred supposedly accepted the criticism and apologized. The story therefore presents a king capable of receiving correction from an ordinary subject without resentment. Whether the incident actually occurred matters less than what the legend came to represent. At the lowest point of his reign, Alfred had lost control of much of his kingdom and was hiding in the marshes while his enemies appeared victorious. Yet this apparent defeat was temporary. From Athelney, Alfred would reorganize his supporters, summon a new army, and launch the campaign that transformed his fortunes. The fugitive king hiding in the marshes was about to begin one of the most remarkable political and military recoveries in Anglo-Saxon history. From his refuge in the marshes of Somerset, Alfred slowly began rebuilding his position. He gathered loyal warriors from the surrounding countryside, organized them into a more effective fighting force, and carried out smaller attacks against Viking positions while waiting until he was strong enough to risk a major confrontation. By the beginning of May 878, Alfred was ready to emerge from hiding. He called the fighting men of Wessex to assemble at a place known as Egbert's Stone, named after his grandfather, King Egbert. Forces from several West Saxon shires answered the summons, giving Alfred the army he needed to challenge the Vikings directly. The decisive encounter came at the Battle of Edington in Wiltshire. Alfred confronted the Viking army commanded by Guthrum and won a major victory. The defeated Scandinavians withdrew into a fortified position, but Alfred pursued them and placed their camp under pressure until Guthrum was forced to negotiate. Alfred could defeat Guthrum, but completely destroying his army was another matter. A political settlement therefore offered a more practical solution. The resulting agreement attempted to replace continuous warfare with a system in which the followers of Alfred and Guthrum could coexist within clearly recognized political arrangements. An especially important condition was Guthrum's conversion to Christianity. Baptism was often used by Christian rulers as a diplomatic tool when negotiating with pagan leaders, since conversion could create a new, personal and religious bond between former enemies. Guthrum accepted baptism, and Alfred became his godfather. This transformed their political relationship into a form of spiritual kinship. Alfred's own Christianity was deeply sincere, so he may genuinely have hoped that Guthrum's conversion would produce a lasting change, rather than serving merely as a convenient political ceremony. Whatever Guthrum's private beliefs, he appears to have respected his new Christian identity publicly. He settled into his territories and ruled with relative stability rather than immediately renewing his war against Alfred. The agreement nevertheless solved only part of Wessex's problem. Viking armies were not controlled by a single ruler, and peace with Guthrum did not prevent other Scandinavian leaders from launching new expeditions. Alfred understood that Wessex needed to prepare for future invasions rather than depend upon one successful treaty. During the years following Edington, Alfred transformed the defensive system of Wessex. His reforms concentrated on three major areas: the army, a network of fortified settlements, and naval defense. The traditional fyrd was poorly suited to fighting Viking raiders. When an attack occurred, royal messengers had to travel through the kingdom and summon local forces to assemble at a particular location. By the time enough men arrived, a mobile Viking force might already have attacked its target and disappeared. Alfred therefore reorganized military service to provide Wessex with forces that could respond more quickly. Instead of calling the entire fyrd away from its homes and farms at the same time, manpower could be divided into rotating groups. One part of the force remained available for active military duty, while another stayed home to maintain agricultural production and other essential work. After a period of service, the groups could exchange roles. This arrangement addressed one of the fundamental problems facing medieval armies. A kingdom needed soldiers, but those same men were also farmers whose labor produced its food. Alfred's system attempted to maintain military readiness without bringing the agricultural economy to a halt. The second element of Alfred's strategy was the creation and strengthening of fortified places known as burhs. These strong points were distributed across Wessex so that Viking forces would find it increasingly difficult to move through the kingdom without encountering organized resistance. Alfred did not construct every fortress entirely from scratch. Some burhs reused older Iron Age hill forts, while others occupied former Roman towns or defensive sites. Existing structures were repaired, expanded, or adapted to meet the needs of 9th century warfare. Location was carefully considered. Fortifications were positioned so that important areas of the kingdom remained within reasonable traveling distance of a defended settlement. This allowed local populations and military forces to reach protection relatively quickly when Viking armies appeared. Natural geography strengthened many of these positions. Rivers, hills, and other defensible terrain were incorporated into the system whenever possible. Navigable rivers were especially important because they served both as transportation routes and as potential invasion corridors for Viking ships. Maintaining dozens of fortifications required enormous resources. Walls had to be constructed and repaired, garrisons needed manpower, and supplies had to be available. Alfred therefore connected military reform with changes in taxation and royal administration. The burh system was more than a collection of isolated forts. It represented a coordinated defensive network designed specifically to counter the Vikings' greatest advantage: their speed and unpredictability. The consequences eventually extended beyond warfare. Protected settlements attracted craftsmen, merchants, markets, and permanent populations. Some burhs gradually developed into important medieval towns. More than 30 fortified centres were associated with Alfred's defensive programme, and several later became substantial urban communities. Oxford is one prominent example of a settlement whose early development was closely connected with the West Saxon burh system. Alfred's third major project was an attempt to confront Scandinavian power at sea. He recognized that defending the coastline alone would always leave the Vikings with the initiative. If Wessex wanted to reduce the danger of maritime attacks, it needed ships capable of challenging enemy fleets. Around 896, Alfred ordered the construction of a small fleet of large warships. Some apparently possessed around 60 oars, making them considerably larger than many Scandinavian vessels operating around England. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Alfred personally influenced their design. The ships were described as larger, faster, and more stable than those of the Vikings, and were perhaps inspired partly by Alfred's knowledge of earlier shipbuilding traditions. In practice, the results were mixed. Their size could become a disadvantage in shallow coastal waters, where the lighter Viking longships were highly maneuverable. Alfred's vessels were therefore not necessarily superior simply because they were larger. Nevertheless, West Saxon forces did achieve some success at sea. At least one engagement developed into a complicated battle, fought partly aboard ships and partly along the shoreline. Alfred's naval experiments were less successful than his army and burh reforms, but the underlying strategic insight was important. He recognized that an enemy whose power depended heavily on ships could not be defeated permanently through land warfare alone. Alfred's preparations were tested during the final decade of his reign. In 892 or 893, another major Viking force arrived in Kent. This expedition was especially threatening because many of the warriors brought their wives and children with them. Their presence suggested that the newcomers were not simply interested in collecting treasure before returning home. They appeared prepared to settle permanently and establish themselves within England. For roughly 3 years, Alfred and his son Edward coordinated campaigns against these Viking forces across the territories controlled by Wessex. The conflict required repeated mobilization and tested the defensive system Alfred had spent years constructing. This time, however, Wessex was far better prepared than it had been during the crisis of 878. Viking armies could still move rapidly and inflict damage, but fortified settlements limited their freedom of movement, while West Saxon forces could respond more effectively. By 896, the major Scandinavian forces had abandoned their attempts against Wessex and moved elsewhere in search of more vulnerable opportunities. Alfred's kingdom had survived another enormous challenge. The contrast with 878 was remarkable. At Chippenham, Alfred had been surprised, driven from his court, and reduced to hiding with a handful of followers in the Somerset marshes. Less than 2 decades later, Wessex possessed a reorganized army, a coordinated network of fortified settlements, improved taxation, and the beginnings of a permanent naval strategy. Alfred's greatest achievement was therefore not simply defeating Guthrum at Edington. He changed the structure of West Saxon defense so that the survival of the kingdom no longer depended entirely on winning a single battle. Wessex had developed institutions capable of absorbing attacks, mobilizing resources, and continuing resistance. Those reforms would outlive Alfred himself. They provided his successors with the military and administrative foundations needed not merely to survive Viking attacks, but eventually to expand into Scandinavian-controlled territories. The struggle that had begun as a desperate defense of Wessex was gradually becoming the foundation for the political unification of England.